Good morning and welcome everyone to the first session of the Mobile Growth Summit. This year, virtual Mobile Growth Summit. We are very grateful to have you with us today, and we are super grateful, of course, to have Harlyn Pacheco, COO of Picap, is going to tell us a little bit more about himself. But today, we're going to be talking about putting LATAM on the map. Remember, if you have questions, hit us on the Q&A. And I'll be able to handle those for Harlyn. Harlyn, thank you so much for joining us today, and the stage is completely yours.
Thank you, Eddie. Gracias, Eddie. Gracias a todos. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. And thank you for taking time out of your days to think about Latin America, to think about mobile growth, and to be in community with all of us virtually. We were, of course, expecting this to be in Mexico City, one of the communities that we value greatly at Picap, and that of course we cherish across Latin America. Instead, we're here today, and we'll take advantage of what this opportunity presents us, which is to bring more folks into the mix, to bring more kinds of interactivity and different kinds of engagement, which actually use the channels that we aim to expand, right? The digital channels. So if this is your first time listening to me, meeting me, congratulations. I'm pleased to meet you. I share my Twitter profile here in case you want to follow some of my takes on different items in global affairs. While you're there on my Twitter, check out a recent post I made on some racial justice organizations that are deserving of attention at this very critical time, not just for racial consciousness and racial justice, but for advancing the cause of equality as it impacts the African-American community, and I would argue as it impacts the Afro-descendant community broadly across the Americas, which we all learn from each other, right? Whatever happens in the US or whatever happens in different parts of Latin America eventually influences each other. And so, truth is, I've been completely blown away by this entire conference. It's been global in nature, and I frankly should just leave to go implement everything I've learned, but I'm going to stay because you're here to learn about Latin America. And so that's why I'm going to stay here. I'm Harlyn Pacheco, COO at Picap. At Picap, we're the biggest two-wheel ride-hailing platform across Latin America. We do about 2 million rides a month. Are doing probably 2 million or so deliveries a year right now on last mile delivery across 12 Latin American cities. Been around for about 2 years, raised about $7 million. Before I was at Picap, I was a Ross MBA. I started an education technology company that was supported by the Gates Foundation, Capor Capital, worked at Accenture, Major League Baseball, did any number of things. And then on the side, I've started to do some angel investing and some venture investing as a micro LP in a little fund. And at this particular moment, why I care about Latin America is not only because I operate in Latin America, because the team that I'm a part of is embedded into the largest growing countries, the largest growing cities in the continent, but also because Latin America is a continent that receives the lowest amount of venture capital per capita of any region across the world. We receive less venture capital than the Indian subcontinent, even though we have a larger middle class. We receive smaller amount of venture capital than other fast-growing regions of the world, and it's time to change that. It's growing, it's changing. And before I began putting together this presentation today, I actually was going to focus mostly on the growth opportunities, mostly on the marketplace analysis, but I decided to flip things around a little bit, and I'll tell you why. We can't ignore the things happening on the continent right now. We can't ignore the fight for racial justice. We can't ignore the impacts of COVID-19 on vulnerable communities, on marginalized communities. And so I decided to apply a lens of equity and awareness to the presentation based on these things that are happening. And one of the things that most irks me and irks folks across Latin America is that when people look at us, they think of us as being this stereotype that's region specific and also not region specific. And we take a lot of issue with that across the continent. We know we're not any of the things that you see here on the slide here, and we know we're much more than that. And we've overcome colonization, and we've overcome fascism, and we've fought for democracy, and we've fought for economic development and growth and equity. We'll continue to do all those things. And so, and I know you're not here because you're the audience that believes these things, but trust me when I say that these are barriers that we face as entrepreneurs, and that we face also as investors in the continent, and that we will overcome, and that we will shape and change in the coming years and decades ahead as we create new visions and new accomplishments for the continent. Some of the things that we have to tackle now are what you see here, right? Oil revenues are decreasing across the continent. It's creating border crisis. It's creating economic dislocation. There are issues of transnational people flows and migration that are not yet resolved. There's lack of economic development opportunities in certain parts of the continent. There's a lot of dependence on U.S. economic growth. There's a vulnerability of our rainforests. There's instability of currencies, and for everyone, COVID-19 is impacting us. Latin America now accounts for 40% of daily coronavirus deaths globally. Sadly, Brazil is set to pass the death count of France and Spain in the coming days. And we remain deeply concerned across the continent on the ways that our governments and our leaders can tackle this issue. And we also reflect on what we as entrepreneurs and technologists, app makers can do about some of these inequalities. Last year, we saw record amounts of investment in Latin America, $4.6 billion. You're probably aware of some of the larger investments that were made in Rappi, Logi, Quinto Andar. You may be aware that most of these investments were concentrated in Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, Argentina. And these are trends that we like and appreciate, and that could change some of those trends on investment that I alluded to earlier about Latin America receiving lower amount of venture capital in other parts of the world. But what I want to say is that this is a season of hard choices. The need for innovations here, it's always been here, but COVID-19 has frankly heightened the critical nature of making sure that we allocate resources to the right things. If we don't tackle COVID-19 as a continent, we're not going to be worried about venture capital investment. We're not going to be worried about apps. We're going to be worried about our family members, ourselves, our communities, our neighbors, and we're not going to get to think about all the other ways that Latin America can begin to play a different role in the world globally. What do I think about startups, and what do I think about B2C apps at this particular moment? Look, there's an opportunity to drive more impact. There's the people out there like the Platzis of the world that are generating lots of critical impact at a time that schools are shut down. There's people out there that are generating brands that have less environmental impact, like the Nacos of the world. And then there's people like Picap, the company that I work at, and Rappi, that are frankly aiming to drive more impact forward because of the scale and footprint that we have at Picap. We have millions of active users per year. Rappi has probably 10x that, 30 million users. I don't know the exact numbers, but all of us want to push forward on driving more impact. All of us want to push forward on improving our unit economics. And we think that there's a gap out there. It's a gap that I'm aware of. It's a gap of addressing not just the needs of low-income users, which are in middle-class users, which the majority of who Picap's users are, and those higher-income users who are the Rappis and the Nubanks of the world, but also thinking about things that are not at scale, right? These are companies that have millions of active users. Like Nubank yesterday said they have 25 million active users. And now we have to think about what apps, what technologies, what companies that maybe aren't operating at the same scale can do, and what they should focus on, and how much attention they should receive, and how much investment they should receive. And that's where I think we can play a really critical role. There's gaps out there that I think are all the more salient and are all the more relevant at this particular time. There are gaps in health that we're deeply aware of at this particular time. There are gaps in conservation, climate change. There are gaps in upward mobility. Frankly, we all can do a lot better on ensuring that either the folks that provide services on platforms and apps that we care about, or the folks who are our end users or end consumers, all have an opportunity to have more and upward mobility and experience more economic opportunity. There are gaps out there on connectivity. Latin America still is one of the largest regions of the world that has a lot of prepaid connectivity, prepaid data, voice platforms, and I think there could be a lot of innovation there. We can learn from other parts of the world, frankly. I mean, that's part of the reason why the Indian subcontinent and South Asian subcontinent has been receiving more capital, right? The Reliance Geos of the world came in and said, let's make voice data as cheap as possible, and let's build stuff on top of that. And I think that's where there's going to be a lot of opportunity to think in on a much larger scale in the coming decades, and in the coming not just decades, but months and weeks ahead, on how we can capture opportunity that's out there in the marketplace, and how we can truly expand the net of impact beyond the pockets that have already received some attention. And that's going to require working with government. That's going to require government working with public sector leaders, public institutions. It's going to require applying lenses of equity to making sure that it's not just folks that graduate in engineering and men and the wider Latin Americans that are receiving investment and leading change in apps and technology and entrepreneurship, but instead folks that are Afro descendants, indigenous descendants, women. And I think that's going to allow us to drive a whole lot more opportunity across the continent. I think it's a disservice to us to not invest in those communities, and we have to. We have to do a whole lot better. In 2019, the amount of money. I'm gonna drink some tea here a second. Hang on, y'all. 100% every day. In 2019, of the amount of money that was invested across venture capital in the region, you see here where it was located, where it was invested. Fintech, logistics, and distribution account for more than 50% of investments. Makes sense, right? Returns on equity are actually better in banks in Latin America and returns on assets are actually better in banks in Latin America than they are in other parts of the world, than they are in North America. There's a lot of inefficiency that can be redistributed, and that can be used to generate other kinds of economic opportunity. There's, of course, marketplaces and transportation, which is where Picap operates. There's prop tech. But what I want to say is that in the coming years, we're going to have an opportunity to think more critically about the kind of impact that the investments made across the continent drive. The prop tech that was invested out there is primarily prop tech that affects higher income end users in Latin America. The logistics and distribution networks that we're invested in will have a net effect and a multiplier effect on low-income communities, folks that are traditionally left out of economic development and economic mobility. Same with the fintech, but it's not the primary starting point. And what I want to say is that maybe in 2020 plus, we can be a little bit more explicit about that at a larger scale. There are folks out there that are focused on prop tech for low-income folks, like the Suyos of the world. There are folks out there in the fintech world, like the Talas of the world, that are trying to bring different kinds of financial services to lower income users, and there's a lot of platforms and apps that are dedicated to these users, but there's still more space, more opportunity to be a lot more explicit about the impact orientation of companies. And I hope that we come together as a continent. I hope that we come together as a set of investors and begin to invest a whole lot more in those opportunities that are going to be able to increase the resiliency of the continent, increase our economic growth and our economic potential, increase our institutional growth, our institutional potential, increase the sustainability of democracies we've worked so hard to build and to achieve. We know that there are some macro elements and macro factors that are going to impact us, right? So a bunch of our central banks and a bunch of our countries have a lot of debts. They're going to take out more debt in the coming months and years ahead. They're going to have to manage the capital flows that are being affected by economic crises that are likely to begin to snowball in the coming months as a result of COVID-19 and as a result of just being leveraged for a whole long time. And part of our challenge is, as app developers, as entrepreneurs, as technologists, is to make sure that when we go out there and speak about the needs of capital that we have and that we've identified, that we of course bring in that impact orientation, so that we identify the opportunities that have married interests and converging interests with that of institutional institutional leaders and in governments, right? So if we're out there investing in healthcare and conservation and mobility and connectivity and learning and laying out some frameworks for universal basic income and equity, governments are going to want to invest in these kinds of opportunities. Governments are going to lay some infrastructure. Governments are going to want to advance regulatory frameworks, which need to advance greatly for many of these opportunities. We're getting some questions here on a buyer or seller's market for term sheets for technologies. I'll answer some of those right now if it helps. But
I think Harlyn, perhaps if you would like, it'd be great if you finish the
okay, and then we'll do Q&A and other stuff.
All
Great.
the questions so that people can interact quicker.
We'll do that.
Awesome.
Great. Look, what I want to say here is that the interests of technologists and app developers and entrepreneurs align with the interests of governments, align with the interests of communities, especially so if we dedicate ourselves to impact. And there's going to be ways that we have to get super creative with creating technologies, entrepreneurship, companies that align themselves to impact. And I think it can happen in two different ways, right? So if you're explicitly dedicated to impact, you have to think about how to reach mass audiences. You have to think about how to be Nubank scale, Rappi scale, Picap scale. And for that, you have to think like the consumer app developers and the consumer technologists that we are. You have to think about your acquisition channels. You have to think about your retention channels. You have to think about incentives to bring people back and re-engage them in the platform and retain them in an economic model that makes sense. On the other hand, if you're coming at this from mostly consumer orientation without much impact orientation, I think having elements of impact is actually going to allow you at this particular time in Latin America, frankly, for the world, to capture the attention of people who are in need, to capture the attention of communities who are in need, and to push forward on regulatory advancements and regulatory frameworks that are necessary to embrace technology, to make sure that we're going to work together with the public sector on making sure that technology raises all boats and is a part of our economic development in the coming years. So it's about the consumer folks having some impact orientation. It's about the impact folks having a consumer orientation, meeting in the middle. Many of the tools that we're learning about today and have been learning about over the last 24 hours of the conference are highly relevant, right? These are the tools that we eat, sleep, and breathe every night when we're looking at our channels, when we're looking at our tableaus, when we're looking at our dashboards. And wouldn't it be great if the people that are dedicated to fostering change and impact in society did the same and had that stakeholder focus from day one? And wouldn't it be great if we had more technologists that could play a critical role in providing some of those opportunities for, again, like I mentioned, impact? Look, we in fact, the region of the world in which I grew up are known for magical realism, right? I grew up just down the road from Aracataca in Colombia, and we're going to play a big role in the region's growth, development. We're going to play a big role in the world's survival. We're going to have in the next 6 months to however many years a young woman from the rainforest in where Colombia, Peru, and Brazil meet, develop some kind of solution that needs to scale, that preserves our rainforest. We're going to have different kinds of discoveries that are related to our health discovered in Latin America, and I want more of those kinds of success stories. I want to invest in those success stories. I want to be a part of those success stories. I already am, and we're going to be there. What I want to say is that the stories of what we've overcome before, the fascism, the colonization, et cetera, have put into our DNA an opportunity to continue to achieve and continue to overcome big tasks. We're aware of what they are now. Now we have some new tools, which is the tools of technology, to try to overcome them. And lastly, I just want to put out a small shout out to a colleague of mine. Diego is a Stanford GSB grad, Diego Antonio Benavides, runs the Latin American Leadership Academy. He's taking folks who are traditionally underserved and who have limited educational opportunity in Latin America, and putting them on paths to go to some most prestigious universities across the world with the aim of developing leaders that then return to the continent, then return to Latin America and dedicate themselves to these missions and these needs that we have. And I think that's just super impressive, and some of the evidence out there of folks doing a lot on the leadership side and on the talent side of the equation. And of course, now it's up to us to do more on the technology side of the equation, the marketplace side of the equation. Eddie, I'll let you take it away on questions and more.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Harlyn, for your insight in Latin America. And of course, we have a few questions already in the pipeline. And I think this is one of the very interesting questions that we are getting, and is, who has the advantage in dictating term sheets? And is it the buyers? Is it the sellers? And I think it's particularly a really good question, Harlyn, because when we think of ourselves as Latin Americans, and when we think of ourselves as, okay, investors that are trying to invest in Latin America, it seems that there is this dynamic of who wins and who loses, when perhaps that's not the question. But I would love to hear from you, where is the leverage when we're talking about Latin American startups that have all this potential to impact the world?
Yeah, and look, this slide here is from Latin American Venture Capital Association. It's a really great resource, lafca.org. The environment's changing. Look, there's a lot of what's called dry powder out there in venture capital firms, and record funds are raised last year. But all of a sudden, what was previously a startup market for dictating terms for the highest, most sought after startups is changing to be an investor's market. And so when I think Dave is asking about whether we're price takers or price setters, we as entrepreneurs are probably becoming a little bit more price takers rather than price setters, because there's a lot more pressure on profitability and a lot more pressure on making sure that runways and sustainable unit economics and cash flow models are put in place by entrepreneurs. And the investors are the price setters. And historically, there's been this big kind of binomial distribution in Latin American investments, where there's this big pool of sought after investments that are the hot, the sexy stuff, and then there's a pool of investments that initially receive capital from so the hot, sexy stuff receives capital internationally, the local stuff receives capital locally, and the local stuff receives lower prices, lower valuations, and the hot, sexy stuff receives higher prices, higher valuations. I think there's pressure on both sides for prices to decrease right now. And Dave, what I want to say is that hopefully that changes as we prove out that we can build sustainable businesses that compete on a global scale and that compete on a continental scale. We have 700 million people in Latin America, and when we reach continent level scale, I think we'll have the opportunity to price set. But right now there's pressure on both sides. Of course, that's deal specific, right? If you're in the next emerging thing, perhaps the thing that's capturing a lot of impact out there that has a lot of potential to not just the food delivery app, maybe you'll be able to price set. And what do I think will be the number 3 country in Latin America? I'm hopeful it's Colombia. But I think, look, there's going to be pressure. There's a lot of great stuff that comes out of Chile, a lot of great stuff that comes out of Argentina. I think Peru is going to emerge as an interesting player in the coming years. And it all depends on how much we decide to give back and invest in the talent, and how much we decide to build up ecosystems. And I'll make myself available, frankly, to anybody who wants to speak more about this, because there's a lot of work that takes place behind the scenes to invest in the next generation of leaders and the next generation of technologists, on an advisory side or an actual capital side. If you want to be a part of those conversations, let me know. I took this particular angle to this presentation because we can't ignore the risks that we're under if COVID-19 freezes our economic growth and begins to impact our family, friends, and neighbors more than it already has.
Excellent, Harlyn. Thank you so much for that insight. And I think one of the questions, and you also shared it on one of your slides when you were putting the breakdown of where the investments are going in Latin America, that would help us perhaps understand a little bit the question that, and my apologies if I'm not pronouncing it right, there are 2 ways of pronouncing this, Marjan Tajipur or Marian Tajipur. What do you think about gaming investments in Latin America for 2020?
Look, like many other parts of the world, mobile penetration is staggering, and it'll continue to grow in Latin America. We have a younger population than other parts of the world, not than every part of the world, and there's more opportunity for games. There's always going to be more opportunities for games and entertainment, particularly at a time when what's the things that are really expensive to produce for entertainment, linear ad supported television, um, film and media that comes out of Hollywood, but it has not being produced. Particularly at a time that there's going to be a gap in entertainment content produced from the traditional players, from the traditional video, television, movie players, and we've already seen successes of some game studios in Latin America, and I believe in investing. I believe in reaching the audience that we have. I believe in our growing middle class. I believe in growing the size of our growing middle class, and I want you to publish games in Latin America or target us and market to us. Somebody's asking about whether publishers need to localize within each country in Latin America. Tropicalization is the thing that you will have to encounter. Words mean different things in Spanish across different countries, and it makes sense to have local teams help you with that. Please bring in local partners to do that. Please co-develop and co-author and co-market with local folks that know the continent, because there's this perennial debate about how you say straw across Latin America. There's tens of words, and if you say the word in Colombia that's used to that means straw in other countries, you're not communicating what you think you're communicating, and so please work with local teams on your marketing and on your audience outreach strategies and on which channels you work with.
Fantastic. And I think we have one question also on the Q&A from Pedro de Arteaga. He says, hi, what would you say are the key factors impacting your app growth efforts versus delivery apps in the US? How does this impact on your growth channels?
So I think he's asking specifically about Picap. Can you repeat that, sorry, Eddie? What are the factors that impact our delivery efforts?
What are the aspects impacting the app growth efforts versus delivery apps efforts?
The app growth efforts versus delivery apps. So delivery apps are playing a different value proposition across different parts of the continent, across different parts of the world, right? In Asia, there's staggering growth. In the US, there's some net growth across certain categories, right? Grocery has a net growth. Prepared food is different on a country by country basis, region by region basis. I think prepared food is net down in Latin America. Prepared food may be slightly up in the US. I don't know the specific numbers, but it's definitely higher in different parts of Asia. For Picap specifically, we don't touch prepared food. We only touch grocery. We only touch last mile delivery for more traditional e-commerce. And the way we grew was by developing the largest fleet of motorcycles across Latin America, because our core value proposition is primarily saving people time across all the many cities where we operate by providing a ride-hailing option that is typically 200% cheaper than an Uber on a Friday afternoon. And when there's standstill traffic in Sao Paulo, Bogota, Mexico City, we lane split at a very, very low speed and deliver and take somebody to their destination a whole lot more efficiently. So that's how we achieved the scale that we achieved for building up the supply side of our driver marketplace at Picap. And that's why we're offering really great delivery times and lots of driver density for those folks that use us for e-commerce last mile, which is now happening across different cities in the continent.
Fantastic, Harlyn. And I think we are coming to an end of the session. I think time went by real fast. I wish we could have more sessions with you. Thank you so much for joining us at the Mobile Growth Summit. This time, hopefully next year will be in person and we'll have you in person. Yeah. We'll be able to meet you. Where can we find more information about you, about Picap, and where can we follow all of your work?
Look me up on LinkedIn. Look me up on Twitter.